Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm not going to share with you, I may have to disappoint you, with any stories about Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., but I'm happy to talk about this during the Q&A if you're interested about this issue. What I want to do in the 20 minutes I have at my disposal is to really, first of all, thank ICT for bringing together such a wide-ranging audience and for its hospitality, and really an invaluable meeting place for many who may not see each other for the rest of the year, but they will always see each other in Herzliya. So I'm very grateful for that, to see new faces and also old friends. And in the spirit of that, I want to begin by outlining really the European perspective on countering violent extremism. And I'm very careful here, given my previous speaker in terms of having a position about confronting the issue directly. Europeans are perhaps more sensitive to the issue of its own communities and trying to differentiate and understand the different groups and the different complexities that exist within major cities, within countries and states. I'll come back to that. That creates a lot of more dilemmas than answers. I want to start with, really, for me, there have been two things that have really changed since 9/11, and particularly for many of you who work in the practical world. And let me outline some of the trends of where terrorism is and going, what are people thinking about who work practically on the issue, and also in the academic sense of where this is going. And also, what do we do about it? I think there's a lot of identification of the problem, but from a European perspective, what are the issues we are working on? How are we thinking about this issue? And I want to just share with you some of those, sort of the work that is going on, the issues that have been identified. Well, let me start by spooks, because the number one thing that I think has been dramatically changing is a paradigm shift in the intelligence community. While this in Israel, of course, is nothing new, you've had this for a long time, but for Europe particularly, we've gone from a paradigm shift from need to know to need to share. We've had also new intelligence architectures that have sewn together horizontally and vertically the different stovepipe agencies, and that has created these intelligence fusion centers, JTAC, GETAS in Germany, which is probably a more complicated kind of structure, but also you have the quite monster structure in the United States, NCTC, which is necessary given that you have 18 different intelligence services, trying to sew together in real time this type of necessary information. As the former head of JTAC said at one of the conferences we organized in terms of describing what is the work like in one of these intelligence fusion centers, he said, in essence, quite laconically, he said, our life can best be described as trying to drink water from a water hydrant on full blast. It's not an absence of information. You have a tsunami of information. And how do you filter that? How do you make sense of that? How do you interrelate that is a major challenge for most law enforcement and intelligence agencies. I want to illustrate this on a personal level because 3 days ago I came from Copenhagen. I came back from the Marshall Center. I see Nick Pratt here, where I was down lecturing. He was here early. As I came home, 2 blocks from our house, this was going on. In Copenhagen, the intelligence community, law enforcement community, had found an individual and arrested an individual who had done an explosive device in the basement of a hostel hotel. Some of you may have heard about this incident. Some of you may not. It was another foiled incident. But what is interesting about this incident is that we are now 3 days on, And this individual on the surveillance camera here on the right, with all the bilateral information that is around, there has not been able to establish his identity. He had 3 fake passports or identity cards. He had a prosthetic leg, which he had filed off the serial number. There are lots of strange, interesting incidences. But it also, I think, shows the complexity in relation to what the EU counterterrorism coordinator often warns about, and that is the lone wolf, individuals working outside organizational structures, taking directives, etc. I think it's illustrative of the challenges that we are facing. The picture down there, the bottom, is when they caught him and thought he had an explosive pouch on his stomach. He didn't, but he certainly is an enigma to the Danish system, who are now struggling to find out who is this individual, who is he working for, are there others working in the background. Given this complexity, and I don't want to get terribly academic with you, but this issue of terrorism is extremely difficult to predict, particularly given that it is a wicked problem, wicked in the sense of being a problem that is of rare occurrence, have an extreme impact, and retrospectively we may try to find ways in which we could have predicted it, but they are really difficult. And it requires understanding the context, not just focusing on the violence, understanding it, as I spent most of my career with Hamas and Hezbollah. If you only looked at the violence, you did not understand where the terror architecture resided, and you did not understand what kind of functionality it served when the Hamas external leadership activated internally to sabotage the peace process, etc. You have to understand the context, and that is extremely difficult today, given the tsunami of information, given the range of different perspectives we have to look at. You also have increasing adaptability of terror groups. It's difficult to detect and determine the modus operandi. I mean, the IED technology has been migrating between groups, between conflict zones, from Chechnya, Iraq, Algeria, to other places. And this goes at a speed which is very difficult for conventional or armed forces or special operations to be able to adapt and adjust to. And I think that is a major challenge. And we heard in the opening remarks, yesterday, the issue of proliferation. And this is really meant by the last point, the butterfly effect of phase changers, that single individuals like A.Q. Khan can have a huge impact on proliferation, on government programs, and potentially also on terrorism programs. So we have to bear that in mind. Well, what are some of the strategic drivers of this? Well, let me very quickly, in the very short time I have, just illustrate briefly this by showing you some examples in my next slides as to what are the issues that are becoming very real. I already mentioned the real-time spread of ideas and tactical thinking and practice. The adversary today understands counterintelligence, understands counter-surveillance. They exchange that type of information. They use encryption or non-encryption, even more simple electronic dead drops. This was standard feast in 2001 or even before. Israel has long been aware of this and have worked in that realm. Technological advances act as a catalyst for rapid societal change. The technology in the next 5 years is going to have an impact on society, but also on how groups adapt to that. And we still don't know what is around the corner or how that may become integrated. And of course, it has an impact on conflict. Demography, refugees may provide a potential recruitment ground for terrorist groups. I mean, that is obvious. For Europe, it's a huge challenge with Frontex that is overwhelmed with a refugee flow from Africa and from nearby areas. And how do you invest? How do you readjust the structures of Frontex is, I think, an issue. And here is a very local issue I want to point out. and that is because of globalization, internal conflicts that usually were internal, with introvert focus, risk becoming internalized. Both inwards with Gaza. Now, what do I mean by that? Iranian influence, Al-Qaeda influence is rapidly becoming or spreading in Gaza, further threatening any peace deal that we may have. You have to recognize that. It also, as Rohan said, Somalia, outward, there may be an outward spiral of becoming internationalized. Horn of Africa, Yemen. I mean, Yemen has, it's obvious that Yemen will be a major focus. It will not replace the epicenter of Pakistan, but it will remain a focus. 80% of its revenue is oil. It will run out 2017. There will be a succession issue. I'm not sure if I would give them 30, like Rohan said, 35% of control in the country. From what I hear, Sanaa is the only place that they control. You have in the midst of that the belt of insecurity between Somalia and Yemen, 200,000 plus Somali refugees. I mean, it is a recipe that we have to focus more concertedly on, otherwise we'll face it potentially back here. How do these four trends manifest themselves? I'm not going to say a great deal. You know these. But this is, of course, Abu Musab al-Masuri, my colleague, Norwegian colleague, Gibrin Elia, did a great book on this issue, contextualizing what this means. Al-Qaeda as a system rather than organization, following directives, common ideology, self-financing, and, of course, I just came back from Germany last week talking to Germans, and they said, look, our problems with individuals disappearing off to Afghanistan, Pakistan, every time we think we have found a profile or we found some sort of center of gravity, we flip a card, and there are more people and there are more constellations that we are really facing. Al-Qaeda, of course, focuses still on civil aviation. I mean, I think it's tragic that I have to explain to my colleagues sometimes or the public that the left-hand picture down there, the so-called Heathrow plot, which would have been the next 9/11, had just a few flights managed to get off the ground, that I have to still explain that's why we have to undertake massive security. These planes that were supposed to take, 7 planes, were supposed to take off with a 2-hour interval from Heathrow, which the UK have dealt with. Al-Qaeda, of course, also focusing on soft targets. Here's Operation Crevice. You've probably seen that picture before, which also, of course, shows that which involved a certain target set. But you also show that in most cases, these are social networks. They know each other, different operations. And it's not just true in the UK. It's also true in many different other countries. Here is also the internationalization of the so-called Mumbai effect. In Denmark, we've just very recently experienced it with David Coleman Headley, who actually came to Jyllands-Posten under false pretenses and pretended to be a business person casing out the different area. He's confessed to the federal authorities in Chicago that his plan was to do a Mumbai-style attack on Jyllands-Posten, its headquarters, cut off the heads of the editors. I'm not sure if that was, in retrospect, something that he concocted to get a lesser sentence, but it certainly illustrates the sharp security environment in which Denmark lives under in relation to a strategic priority of targeting the country because of the cartoon affair. So the incident I showed just around the corner from my house, this incident with a more serious, organized effort to strike at Denmark is, of course, very serious. There's often description about Al-Qaeda, and I always, this is maybe the academic part of me. I try to sort of find what's the best way of describing them. And this is actually not mine. I have to give credit to John Arkilla and David Ronfeld, who were thinking about dark networks, flash mobs, and so on. This sort of description appeals to me, the spin model, because it shows the different overlapping dimensions you will see on the right-hand side. It's segmentary, the different centers of gravity, the different strengths. It's polycentric, and it's networked. And I think this is really, I think it's a complex academic description, but I think it really shows which way the multi-dimensional layers of this sort of beast and the way it is evolving. EU terrorist battlefield. I'll show. This is a simple map, but it shows what are some of the concerns. In Northern Europe, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Netherlands share the issue of the Somali dimension that's been discussed earlier. It's not so much radicalization, but rather recruitment of individuals. We also have some senior people down in Somalia that are actively taking part in Al-Shabaab. Danger, of course, is, well, will they peel off, come back? There seems to be a trend. The AfPak, they've deliberately put Germany in the epicenter of that. A lot of people are disappearing. I'll show you a slide in 1 second. Of course, Pakistan, the United Kingdom, who's had since 2000, good article by Michael Clark and Russi summarizing this. They've had 20 serious terrorist plots in the UK since 2000, over the 10 years, with 235 convictions. And Michael Clark is warning about these individuals coming out of prison radicalization. What do we do in terms of rehabilitation? Akim, we should not forget Akim issue, particularly in relation to France. I see Judge Bruguier here, and other countries that are being threatened by that. And of course, ACAP, Iraq a little bit, but particularly ACAP and Somali-Yemen issue. Now, we talk a lot about the threat. What do we do about it? Here's a visualization of the EU counterterrorism strategy. And there's a lot of activity trying to join up the 27 member states in relation to forging a strategy. Now, both Rohan and I were at the Defense Academy in 2003 when Sir David Omand presented contest for the first time, the 4 Ps. The European Union have stolen this or borrowed it or plagiarized it in academic terms, and they've changed the last letter to R, respond. Well, I'm sure Sir David wouldn't mind. It is his vision. And if you look at the 4 Ps, and the purpose of that is to really sort of, some of these prevent, prepare, protect, pursue, respond. Some of those are designed to be tactical firefighting, but the overarching goal of all of the all of the counterterrorism strategies is to have society bounce back as quickly as possible. Of course, the EU has a good way of rationalizing why we should have that, and what does that do for the European Union in so many different areas. It strengthens national capabilities using best practice, shared knowledge, facilitate European cooperation, develop collective capability, Situation Center, Europol, Eurojust, Frontex. There's a lot of activity that goes on that you often do not see. Promoting international partnerships, both within countries, the United Nations and its strategy, as well as with other countries. I have to mention human rights. I have to also show a picture of Dekakov, because I think that this is really illustrative of someone who understands intelligence, but also have been very effectively arguing on a number of different fronts, and very honestly arguing a number of different issues, and also resolved issues between the U.S. and the United States. This was a major stumbling block on the human rights issue, the Guantanamo issue. And Europe have admitted, I think, 20 Guantanamo detainees to certain member states. He outlines often a number of different challenges. In May of this year, there were these different issues that were in the forefront, particularly terrorism, travel, Yemen, and also boosting, I think, where Europe can have a real capacity building, enhanced measure, working as a complement to the United States, is in the capacity building area. Spending 15 million euros on Pakistan, Yemen, 10 million. They're developing a JCLEC, Jakarta Center for Law Enforcement Cooperation style law enforcement training center in Bangladesh. So the EU is getting its act together in terms of capacity building, in building police cooperation, building these different areas. And also one big issue is ensuring the monitoring of terrorist travel. Homegrown terrorism. There are two issues, I think, that if it wasn't me standing before you, but rather the CT coordinator, he would say two things. He would say, first of all, the homegrown issue, as defined here, the emergence of lone wolves. That is what we will face on the horizon. I think the second issue, he will say, is that there is a growing counterterrorism fatigue. And that is a huge challenge, particularly in Europe, in terms of counter-radicalization programs. Nothing has happened. We have been successful, and people will face huge cutbacks. Look at what's happening in the United Kingdom with the Prevent debate. In Holland, it's the same way. They're going to cut the budgets. So how do you deal with this issue on a strategic framework in preventing? Denmark has had everything. I'm not going to go through them. He has everything. In this picture, you'll have all the different profiles and motivations. You have the recruiter Said Mansour to Iraq. You've had on the left-hand side, the young people, 16 to 20-year-olds, being influenced by the ones with the arrow to the serious ones in Sarajevo who were caught. Post Morsa, you had everything. You had even converts. You had hang-arounds. You had all the different. And to the right hand, Glassface case was a serious one, which connected up to what Rohan was describing as the Al-Qaeda core, the really serious Al-Qaeda people. Radicalizers are usually at the fore. Here is a picture that's never been shown outside, and it's someone who is at the heart of radicalization and recruitment or believed, alleged to believe, is figured in every single terrorist investigation. He's the one who is sort of focusing in on converts, and all the cases I showed before have he's been involved with, but he's never been convicted, and he's been extremely smart at evading prosecution. So he's also feared by every other mainstream imam. Kurt Westergaard, of course, has been one of the reasons for why the issue has been such divisive. Let me just tell you that there was a Somali who attacked him with the axe, and it took under 1 minute for me to find his house, his address. I could find an aerial photograph of him. It took 30 minutes for the axeman to go through, and it was a very close call. He managed to get into his panic room and call the law enforcement. Western foreign fighters, as I said, I just came back from Germany. They're extremely worried about this issue, about the individuals going there, following the Sauerland case. Here is these figures talks for themselves in relation to the appeal. And one of the reasons has been that all the jihadi material, the recruitment material, has been in German. It's also interesting that there's a Turkish dimension to this issue as well, which did not figure earlier. There are bridge figures. This is my most favorite, most interesting person, Malika Al-Arud. Brilliant photograph of her. You don't often have women involved in this, but she is one strong woman whose new husband, is still out in the Afpak area. She was sentenced in May 2010 to 8 years in prison. She recruited online, and she recruited particularly young people in Belgium. She was convicted in Switzerland. She's one of many visible and less visible bridge figures from these conflict zones. The different causalities of radicalization, I'm not going to go through that because I can see that it's blinking red here down here at the front. But it's not all about ideology, but ideology is a very important part of this. But there are lots of different dimensions, and group dynamics is, of course, is a very important part of this. I think that you'll find all the different constellations of all of these different factors, depending on whatever case. And that has made the issue of profiling, providing indicators for law enforcement, exceptionally difficult. EU, of course, is not deterred by this, so they're making a lot of efforts to try to divide up the expertise, and they have really 6-7 portfolios in terms of leading the work on this, centralizing the work on this, and then imparting that to the other member states. Spain is training religious leaders in Europe. UK, of course, has already done the work with RICU, the Research Information Communication Unit, strategic communications. How do we communicate against the Al-Qaeda propaganda narrative? Or rather, I would say a more apt description of this would be, how do we do jujutsu on the radical extremist rhetoric? How do we sideline it? How do we go underneath and above it? How do we not play into this? And that is why you see every U.S. ambassador here who was here yesterday, you will see President Obama, etc., be extremely careful about the language that they use in relation to not feeding into that. Now, there are lots of different dimensions into this, but I just raised this issue. Germany monitoring the internet, Netherlands, I wouldn't say best practice, but rather lessons learned. Belgium, community policing, in terms of indicators of radicalization, providing the community police forces in Europe with a better tool to try to detect them. And of course, Denmark has the difficult task of de-radicalization, and how do you support the individuals exiting from organizations linked to terrorism. And there are lots of different issues. The 3 lead states in Europe, I won't be able to go into them, but let me just say the UK, which are revising contest. Secondly, the Netherlands, who have strategies in cities, and we should not forget cities, not waiting for the state, but the city on the city level have developed in many different cities programs that are worthwhile recognizing. Let me just mention RECORA Institute is an alliance of cities across Europe that are sharing best practice. So you have all of this activity. We are very much embryonic. The third country is Denmark. The Danes have been extremely innovative when it comes to developing an idea catalog with the school, social services, police, all the imams. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I sat with 200 of all the people, leading players in Denmark. It was me and Bob Lambert. We were the only foreigners, and they were all innovating in relation to what do we need to do? How do we work with young people? What do we do as counter nodes for people not getting swept into radicalization? And they have been very agile, contrary to all the reports about how Denmark may approach this issue. These are the challenges. This is my last slide. And there are some serious challenges from a European perspective on this issue. And there is by no means unanimity or uniformity in the different approaches. The number one thing is a very difficult issue, is how do you talk about this issue? What terminology do you use? I put in my first slide, countering violent extremism, because there is a continuity between Islamist extremism and right-wing extremism. They feed off each other. But also, research has shown in some countries that too much media attention, too much discussion by politicians, and this is particularly in Holland, has led to stigmatization of target communities. The UK is also extremely sensitive about this issue. But there is no uniform formula of how do you address this. There's no uniform terminology This is a very difficult issue, and we are not all like the British joined up and can communicate those kind of advice out to the civil servants. There are others who argue we should be upfront about this, we should just tackle it straight on. There's no need to tap dance around the fire. So I'm not judging what is the best approach, I'm just raising the issue. It is there on the policy level, and it is an issue we need to address. Solutions in the EU is handled uniquely at the national level, and compounding the difficulty of understanding and addressing the issue is that there are different integration models and strategies. I mean, we will not have this discussion with the French. There are different countries who have different models of integration. And more importantly, and the fourth point is really at the heart of why there is a contest revision, why the contest 2 is being revised. There is a difference between CT-related and CT-relevant policies. And this sort of, how wide do you draw out the different countermeasures? And what are the implications? Which agencies are the lead? What end game do you want to achieve by all of these different measures? This is really at the heart of the issue. Second to last, there is no metrics or best practice, what works. There is only lessons learned. You know, we don't know. I mean, the Danes have a evaluation 2013, it's supposed to be finished. I think whenever I speak to British officials, they say, oh, the Dutch are the lead on this. They've been experimenting. The confetti approach is working. When I speak to the Dutch, they look at the British and say, well, the British are well ahead of us. So there really isn't any. And I think that there is important to the reason why I want to highlight this is that in terms of talking about countering violent extremism, there's often discussions about the context, about the phenomena, about the radicalization in Europe of individuals. And there's no continuity between what are the measures. And the measures, of course, have an impact on how the community feels about the issues, what are the solutions, what are the, how do we build partnerships? And certainly this brings me to my last point, and that is there's too much focus on the issue of responding or preventing the issue, detecting, finding, deprogramming, diverting. We need to also, in the spirit of Sir David Oman, think about, okay, what if the Danish incident slipped through? How do we maintain and how do we minimize polarization in society? Because ultimately that is what counterterrorism or counter-radicalization is all about. And on those words, let me thank you for your attention, and thank you, Chairman, for not interrupting me despite the light blinking red. Thanks.